Okay, this is Brad here, and this morning I am joined by Dr. John Fia. Dr. Fia is professor of American history at Messiah College in Pennsylvania. He's the author of Was America Founded as a Christian Nation? And his latest book, Believe Me, The Evangelical Road to Donald Trump, was published by Erdman's in June 2018. And he is a prolific blogger. If you haven't had a chance to check out his blog, The Way of Improvement Leads Home, visit thewayofImprovement.com and it will bless you. He has been on NBC, MSNBC, CNN, NPR, C-SPAN, and so we are really honored to have you, John, with us today.
Thanks, Brad. It's good to be with you. And also, I know this goes out to different people in the heritage community. I really enjoyed my visit there a few years ago in one of your lecture series. So hello to everyone else from the heritage community as well.
Thank you so much. We really remember that time, and you really blessed our campus by visiting with us.
Thanks.
So I was reading one of your articles recently that was published on your blog, and it had to do with early 20th century evangelist Billy Sunday, and his response or connections to the 1918 influenza outbreak. And so I thought maybe we could discuss that for a few minutes, if you don't mind. So
sure.
For our audience, many of them probably are unfamiliar with the name Billy Sunday. So maybe let's start out. Could you tell us a little bit about who Billy Sunday was and what his significance was during the early 20th century?
Yeah, sure. Billy Sunday was one of the great evangelists of really American history, but especially of the 20th century. He was a professional baseball player. Actually, I think he was a second baseman who had a conversion experience at a mission in Chicago. I think he played for the White Sox, if I remember correctly, and had a conversion experience, decided to give up baseball and travel around the country preaching the gospel as a sort of full-time evangelist. Billy Sunday really falls into a kind of stream of big-time revivalists in American history. Really, I think you could trace it all the way back to like the 18th century. People like George Whitefield, Charles Finney in the 19th century, early 19th century. Then you have people like Dwight L. Moody in the late 19th century. Then you have Sunday, and then you could probably continue that thread through the 20th century with Billy Graham. So he was one of these, top 5, top 6 evangelists, traveled all around the country doing these huge crusades. He would stay in a city for weeks or months at a time. He would build these wooden tabernacles in cities. They would have to construct they called them the Billy Sunday tabernacles. He'd build these tabernacles. They'd cover the floor with sawdust. And thus, when people sort of responded to the gospel message and went forward, they often referred to that as walking the sawdust trail. But he was a very enthusiastic, exciting kind of, I compare him to a kind of almost like a vaudeville act. He was entertainment. He would do all these crazy things, bodily things, running around the stage, sliding across the stage like a baseball player, climbing up, standing on top of the pulpit and kind of pointing and screaming. He was a staunch, in addition to preaching sort of the gospel, right? This is what you must do to be saved. Right. He was also, early 20th century, he was a strong proponent of prohibition. So he also preached a famous sermon wherever he went called Get on the Water Wagon, right? About sort of getting off alcohol. And he usually worked with the local prohibition forces to try to get prohibition passed in some of these cities. One of my favorite crusades with Billy Sunday was his 1918 Chicago crusade, which actually came before the one we'll talk a little bit about today, in which he worked very, very hard to try to get Chicago and the state of Illinois to pass a prohibition, to endorse prohibition, and failed. So I don't know how much your listeners here will know about the famous Frank Sinatra song, Chicago, but there's a great line in that song. Go listen to it on YouTube.
Definitely.
The town that Billy Sunday could not shut down, right? So Chicago took great pride in the fact that Billy Sunday came to Chicago and could not shut the place down. But he was a character, as well as a very devout sort of evangelical, who was very political too. I mean, he blamed, had strong opinions about Germany during the war. I think he prayed, they asked him to pray in the Senate or the House of Representatives, I can't remember, and he gave this kind of anti-German prayer in which he prayed things like, Lord, we pray that you would stop the Germans whose fangs bleed with gore, and very graphic in his kind of language. So I had a friend who was an evangelical Christian who we used to grade AP exams, history exams together back in the day. And we wear shorts and t-shirts, and he had a t-shirt that said, Billy Sunday, evangelical with an attitude. I used to love that t-shirt. So, if you want to learn more about Sunday, there's a lot of good biographies about him. The best one still, I think, is Lyle Dorset's biography, published with Erdman's Press on Sunday. But fascinating guy.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And he seems like a just sort of a larger than life figure.
Yeah.
Who sort of transcended his time. But as a historian, what was it that particularly interested you in Sunday and wanting to research his campaigns and sort of, what the experiences were like for him in the early 20th century?
Yeah. So I first got interested in Billy Sunday. I've never published a book or anything on Billy Sunday. But back very, very early in my career, in the early 90s, actually, mid-90s, I published an essay on Sunday in the Journal of Illinois History on his Chicago Crusade, which I was just talking about. And that was the town that Billy Sunday could not shut down kind of thing. I'm an American religious historian by training. I study the evangelical movement as part of my work. So I published this article, and so I knew a little bit about him. I spent a lot of time with him working on this article and his papers and so forth. Most of that article was on prohibition. It was really an article about prohibition in Chicago and how Billy Sunday, dealt with it. But when the when the coronavirus started kicking in here, I'm also, a historian who likes to think about sort of how the past helps us better, equips us better for the future. And since my focus is I do a lot of stuff with religious history, I thought, Billy Sunday, I went back to that original article, I thought, I wonder what he was doing during the pandemic. Where was he? Was there a crusade? Did it get shut down? And of course, this was all in light of all of the debates and controversies going on right now about the shutting down of churches during the coronavirus. So I thought, let me try look for some historical context here. I'd be curious how someone like that would have responded. So first I thought, 1918, right, was the influenza. Who would have been the biggest figure in religion at that time, and how would he have responded, or she, but in this case happened to be he.
Yes.
And it was Sunday. So these kinds of things all came together, and I started digging a little bit into his response to the pandemic.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. A lot of folks have been sort of making those connections between the 1918 pandemic and ours. And I understand that Sunday had a revival scheduled for Providence, Rhode Island, that was impacted by the flu outbreak.
So so I know you've had some other people come on talking about the flu and so forth, the so-called Spanish flu or the influenza of 1918. That came in two waves. So there was a wave in the spring, very similar to what we're experiencing right now with the coronavirus. But then there was a second, probably more deadly wave. And then I think not probably, but much more deadly wave
Right.
in the fall. So Billy Sunday had been in Chicago. I mentioned he'd done a few more crusades during the year. But in September of 1918, he came to Providence, Rhode Island,
Okay.
for what was scheduled to be a couple months of preaching. So he would come every night. They'd build a tabernacle. He'd preach every night. He'd preach, 2 or 3 times on Sunday. And so midway through, or maybe 3 weeks into the crusade, the influenza hit Providence pretty hard. And excuse me for looking here to my right, but it's just the statistics I have here in front of me. I mean, in the entire year, I think 1,000 people in the city of Providence died from the influenza. But in October alone, right in the middle of the crusade, 6,000 people in the city had contracted the flu. And so Sunday had some decisions to make. And one of the first things, if there's any kind of things to think about it, how he responded, one of the first things he did was classic Billy Sunday. He blamed the flu on the Germans, right? Because America is in the middle of a war in 1918, right, with Germany. It made me think, and I don't want to get too political here, but it made me think of the president of Liberty University, Jerry Falwell Jr., who, if you remember, very early in the coronavirus, he went on Fox News and he said that this coronavirus could be China or even North Korea trying to poison us or kill off Americans, or evangelical habits die hard, right? I mean, Falwell's dad, Falwell Sr., very much comes from the Billy Sunday tradition of preachers. But the first thing Sunday did was he blamed the Germans. So I'm going to just read real quick here, what he said when the influenza began to kick in Providence. He said, quote, "We can meet here tonight and pray down an epidemic just as well as we can pray down a German victory. The whole thing is a part of their propaganda. It started over there in Spain, again, remember the Spanish flu, right? Where they scattered germs around, and that's why you ought to dig down all the deeper and buy more Liberty bonds." Again, Sundays was always a patriot, as well. "If they can do this to us 3,000 miles away, think of what the bunch would do if they were walking our streets. There's nothing short of hell that they haven't stopped to do since the war began. Darn their hides," right? Good evangelical, right? Darn their hides. So, initially this was a kind of a threat from the Germans. Somehow it was coming from Europe, right? And Sunday never, there was never a battle he didn't want to fight, right? So this was initially how he responded to the pandemic. Eventually, the city of Providence was forced to close down the crusade. At least for 3 weeks, and then it came back. But it was in this age of social distancing, it was real. You can't help but sort of notice certain things about this crusade. At one point, the mayor and then the board of aldermen in Providence, Rhode Island, closed down all businesses except they let Sunday preach for a couple more days. He had 3 services on a Sunday in the heart of the pandemic. And you read the newspaper accounts, both the local newspaper accounts in the city of Providence, but also a lot of the religious periodicals of the day covered Sunday. You hear these accounts of people just packed in, right? 6,000 people are sick, right? They're packed into this tabernacle. one religious periodical said like Sunday shook 10,000 people's hands, right? That just jumped. I would have probably just skipped over that, right? If I was reading that in another time, but it just jumped out at me, right? 10,000 hands he shook, especially reading it today. People, there's accounts in the newspapers of people literally passing out from influenza related, illness, from the illness in the tabernacle while Sunday's preaching. And then the newspaper accounts are also fascinating when you look at them. There's like on one column, it talks about people who are dying or are sick from the influenza. And in the next column, it's like Billy Sunday had 5,000 people in his. So it's really this, in this age of social distancing, you sort of see things about the past that you may not have noticed. If you would have been reading this and, maybe even if I was doing this back in 1994.
Right. That's really fascinating. And so at first, Sunday blames the outbreak on Germans and continues to hold his revivals.
Yeah.
Did his attitude shift during this period of time at all?
Yeah, great question. So you would think you would think that Sunday would, the natural inclination, especially in light of the way we're seeing some of these evangelical preachers today, very few today, refusing to close their churches. Sunday does submit. He says that, this is good. He's happy. He says he uses the term the public good, which is interesting. He says, I'm happy to serve the public good. I have no problem with closing this down. Sunday himself is also very concerned too. I think what really hits him is when his partner in ministry, who also happens to be his wife, Helen Ma Sunday, they called her Ma Sunday. She goes home in the middle of the crusade because they have to close down their summer house in Winona Lake, Indiana, where he lived. Actually, today there's a Christian college and seminary there, Grace University and Grace College and Seminary. And you could still visit Sunday's house. There's a incredible museum to Sunday, which I've had the chance to visit. But Ma Sunday goes back to close the house, and she contracts the flu. Mm. So, it's hard to tell what Sunday is thinking. He continues. This actually happens before the closing. So he continues to preach. He stays in Providence, and Ma eventually recovers. But, maybe the work of the gospel is more important. Who knows what he was thinking? But this may have hit him between the eyes too, and said, I'm just speculating here, saying like, this is serious, we need to close. So he does close, and then they come back 3 weeks later and continue the crusade, as kind of if nothing happened.
Well, you referenced ministers, how they're responding, church leaders, how they're responding today to these sort of emergency stay-at-home orders that are coming from governors and mayors and other leaders. So as we get ready to wrap up, I'm thinking about what lessons we can learn from Sunday's experiences in Providence, because it seems to me, at least from my perspective, that most church leaders are respecting these orders, but at the same time, there have been people really from the very beginning that have said, this is an attempt by the government maybe to take away our religious liberty and continue to hold these large services. So what do you think of the lessons are for us to learn from this experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's three sort of ways of contextualizing our current moment using Sunday. One I've already mentioned, but I think the fact that Billy Sunday kind of should be commended, right, for listening to, we assume a science-based medical health professionals who say, look, you got to close this place down.
Right.
So I think there's a lesson there for all Christians, or, especially evangelicals who follow in Sunday's tradition. Right. I'm not sure how much power a historical reference to Billy Sunday would have for, these this guy in Louisiana, Tony Spells, and some of these other people who refused to close, this guy in Florida who got arrested. But but that is one lesson, right? Here is an evangelical Christian. There's no discussion whatsoever from what I see in terms of religious freedom and that sort of thing. So I think you see that. I think again, the social distancing kind of thing. You have to wonder, knowing what we know now, you have to wonder how much those crowds before Sunday's crusade was closed, you have to wonder how much those crowds may have contributed to the spread of coronavirus. Now, again, whether or not of the influenza in 1980. Again, we'll never know, right? And it's hard to judge Sunday or anyone else, right, for this. But it is an interesting question, right? All the handshaking and the crowds and the and then you also have to wonder then whether some of Sunday's early kind of patriotic zeal against the Germans, right? This is a threat against us, and we're going to stay here and fight it with the word of God, right? You wonder how much that may have blinded, or at least maybe not blinded, but sort of encouraged, this kind of close gatherings, these crowds that came together. Again, this is not a kind of condemnation of Sunday or a sort of praise of Sunday. I think he does deserve praise for obeying the law, right? For obeying but they're just interesting questions to raise, right? Knowing what we know now about what happened there. And sometimes that's the way historians work, right? There are no definitive answers. The past gives us lessons, puts things into context for us. But we very few historians would say that the past, tells us what to do in the present, because the present could be completely different, right? Or slightly different, or different time, right? But on the other hand, it does provide some interesting links. So that's all I tried to do. This was just a short piece I wrote on my blog. I'm hoping to maybe publish it at some point, but we'll see how that goes.
Well, it's been fascinating to listen to you discuss Billy Sunday. I know our audience will enjoy learning about him and also the connections between the 1918 influenza outbreak and the current situation we're dealing with. And what strikes me is the similarities of the past to the present, but also the differences and the challenges of trying to navigate as historians, trying to navigate those, and contextualize the experiences of the past to what we're dealing with today. And I think you've helped us do that tremendously. And we really appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Brad. This is fun.
Yeah, thanks a lot, and stay safe and take care, and look forward to talking with you again soon.
I will.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Bye.